Hey, hi, hello. Welcome to Diana Emerson today. We are listening to the Wichita Massacre.
On December 8, 2000, 23-year-old Andrew Schreiber was abducted at gunpoint. Andrew was an assistant baseball coach at Newman University and was an avid baseball lover, so it was his dream job. He had been shopping at a convenience store in Wichita, Kansas, when he was startled by a man pointing a gun at him. Andrew did as he was told, moving from the driver's seat to the passenger seat of his 1998 Ford Expedition. The gunman pulled the SUV into an alley and another armed man got into the vehicle. Andrew was a young, fit athlete who kept on the right side of the law. This kind of danger was completely foreign to him and he was terrified, but managed to keep his cool. He followed the orders his abductors gave him as they drove from ATM to ATM and withdrew the maximum sum of cash from each. Andrew would later say, quote, "I was just hoping that if I did what they said, they'd let me live." The men drove the SUV around a bit before driving to a field nearby. When they arrived at the location, Andrew's anxiety reached its peak, but instead of turning the gun on him, the two men told him to lie on the floor of the back seat. They told him that they would leave the keys in the road, and then they asked him if he had a spare tire. When he said yes, they shot at one of the tires of his car and told him to wait 20 minutes before moving. Then they stole his watch and fled the scene. As Andrew made his way back into town to report the crime, he had no way of knowing that what he'd experienced wasn't a one-off incident. In fact, it was the beginning of a crime spree that would terrify the city of Wichita. This is Monsters. Once the assailants were gone, Andrew went out to the road and found his keys. Then he limped his vehicle home on the flat tire where he called 911. It seemed he didn't have the ability to change the tire if he had a spare, but it's not explained anywhere. Andrew had been hit on the head multiple times, but he was lucky to be alive. Linda Ann Walenta, who went by Ann, was a 55-year-old librarian and cellist who worked for the Wichita Symphony Orchestra. On December 11, 2000, Ann finished up a late rehearsal with the orchestra and returned home at around 9:30 p.m. She had just finished parking her car in the usual place, on the street directly outside the house she shared with her husband, when a man walked up to her telling her that he needed some help. As Ann rolled the window down, the man pulled out a gun and aimed it at her head. Ann's first instinct was to turn the car back on and attempt to drive away, but it was still running. As she turned the key, the man told her not to move, but she put the car in reverse anyway. That's when the man opened fire. The bullet pierced the window on the driver's side, severely wounding her. Unable to continue driving, Ann repeatedly hit the car's horn, causing the neighbors to call the police. Unfortunately, by the time officers arrived, Ann had fallen unconscious and there was no sign of her attacker. The man had fired 3 bullets, and one of them severed Ann's spinal cord, instantly paralyzing her from the waist down. While Ann was fighting for her life in the hospital, drifting in and out of consciousness, her assailant and his accomplice struck again. Late in the evening of December 14th, 2 armed men broke into a house on East Birchwood Drive. The house's usual occupants were 3 men in their 20s, 26-year-old Jason Beffert, 27-year-old Brad Haka, and 29-year-old Aaron Sander. That night, they had 2 visitors at the house with them, 25-year-old Heather Muller, who was Aaron Sanders' ex-girlfriend, and the other 25-year-old woman known only as Holly G. Holly had also brought her beloved pet schnauzer, Nikki, with her. Holly was a teacher at Rose Hill Elementary and had been dating Jason for a while. He was also a teacher, and the pair were completely smitten. Jason had actually been trying to work up the courage to propose to her, even buying a ring and a book full of proposal tips, but he still hadn't found the right moment to pop the question. Holly arrived at the triplex before Jason, so she used the time to grade some papers as she waited for Jason to get home from basketball practice. He was the science teacher and coach for the junior varsity basketball team.
No barking. No.
The 5 friends spent some time catching up over dinner, then watched television for a few hours before they went to sleep. Holly and Jason were in bed together when the room was suddenly illuminated by the porch light. Jason was annoyed, saying to Holly, quote, "Don't tell me I have to get up and turn off the light again." Holly tried to check the clock next to the bed to see what the time was. She couldn't see the whole screen because Jason's head was blocking her view, but she could tell that it was at least 11 p.m. Suddenly, the bedroom door flung open and a man holding a gun appeared in the doorway. He strode into the room and pulled back the sheets that were covering Holly and Jason. A second man walked in a few seconds later, dragging Aaron with him and pushed him down onto the bed. Holly's dog Nicky, who had been woken up by the intruders, began to growl. One of the intruders told Holly and Jason, quote, "Grab your dog or we'll shoot her." The other man asked if there were any other people in the house, and once they were given directions to the rooms where Brad and Heather were sleeping, one assailant went downstairs to retrieve them. Because the bedroom was mostly dark, Holly found it hard to tell the two intruders apart. She could see that both of them were black, and the one who had entered the room first was slightly taller and more muscular than the second intruder. One by one, Brad and Heather were brought into the room. With all of the house's occupants now confined in one room, the intruders ordered them to hand over all of their cash. But none of the 5 victims had any cash on them, so they handed their debit cards over instead. While the intruders were burgling the house, one of them called out that they had found a diamond ring hidden inside a box of popcorn. That's how Holly found out that her boyfriend was planning on proposing to her. Then the intruders ordered them to take off all of their clothes, tied them up, and forcibly pushed all 5 people into a small closet in the bedroom. Over the next few hours, they would remove Holly and Heather from the closet to sexually assault them, and, on several occasions, Brad, Jason, and Aaron were forced to perform sexual acts with the women at gunpoint. They were told that if they weren't able to perform, they would be shot. One by one, the victims were driven to nearby ATMs where they were forced to withdraw all the money they could. When the crime was complete, the Carr brothers were willing to destroy 5 lives for about $1,850. After that process had been completed for all 5 victims, the intruders forced them into Aaron's car. Jonathan drove the car while Reginald drove Jason's truck to the outskirts of the city, stopping at the Stryker soccer complex. At the soccer field, the victims were forced out of the car in order to kneel down next to each other in a line. All 5 victims were executed. They were shot once at point-blank range in the back of the head. As the attackers fled the scene, they carried out one last act of violence, deliberately driving the truck over the dead bodies of their victims. Heather, Brad, Jason, and Aaron were either dead or dying, but miraculously, Holly was still alive. She had been wearing a plastic barrette in her hair, and the bullet had glanced off the smooth plastic, grazing the side of her head and fracturing her skull instead of entering her brain. In the dark, her attackers hadn't noticed that Holly was simply stunned instead of dying. Holly had been awake when she'd heard the intruders talking about what to do next, and she'd been awake when they had slowly, deliberately driven their truck over her body. Once she was sure that the killers were gone, Holly desperately tried to save Jason's life by bandaging his head wound. At that point, Holly was freezing cold. She was completely naked and not wearing any shoes, and the ground was covered in snow. Despite the weather, the bullet wound to her head, and the fact that she'd recently been run over, when she saw a building in the distance, she managed to walk over a mile to get to the front door. On her way, every time she saw headlights, she dove to the ground and covered herself with snow because she was afraid the monsters that had terrorized her were coming back. When the homeowners saw a bleeding, naked woman on their doorstep, they let her inside the house and called 911. Holly was concerned that she was going to die from her injuries, so she rushed through the description of the crime, sharing as much information as she could with the 2 strangers who had invited her into their home. Police and ambulances rushed to the scene, but it was too late to save any of Holly's friends. They were also too late to save Holly's schnauzer, Nicky. After shooting the 5 friends, the 2 killers had gone back to the house and beaten Nicky to death with a golf club. It turned out that the brothers returned to the house and, along with murdering a dog, stole anything else of value. They then returned to the vehicle they had driven to the area in, a borrowed tan Toyota, and returned to their homes. The horrifying nature of the crime shocked the community, and the events that had taken place that night soon became known as the Wichita Massacre. Shortly after the murders, the police arrested a man matching the description of one of the killers. His name was Reginald Carr. At the time he was apprehended, Reginald was carrying Heather Muller's watch and Jason Beffert's gas card. A brief search of his apartment revealed a collection of other items that belonged to the victims, but there was no sign of whoever his accomplice in the crimes had been. When the news that one man had been arrested in connection to the crime broke, a tip was quickly called in to the police. Reginald's brother, Jonathan Carr, was staying at the apartment of one of his friends, and the friend was watching the news when she saw a report of Reginald's arrest. Immediately, she knew who the accomplice was. Reginald had committed the crimes with his own brother. The friend and her mother called the police, telling them that they believed they knew who the killer was. Jonathan was quickly arrested, and just like his brother, he was in possession of multiple items that belonged to the victims. One of them was a diamond engagement ring, the one that Jason had planned to use to propose to Holly. Based on the evidence, the police theorized that the Carr brothers' motive had truly been financial. Once they decided they were going to rob people, they saw no reason why they shouldn't sexually assault, terrorize, and
Okay.
murder their
Thank
victims.
you.
Anne Walenta, who was still in critical condition, positively
Yeah.
identified Reginald Carr as one of her assailants.
Uh,
Shortly afterwards, she passed away from injuries, increasing the Carr brothers' death toll by one more
I told
victim.
you don't break
But
my
despite
son's
being
heart.
shot in the head,
do
one of the
anything that
victims
weekend.
of the
He was the
Wichita
one that got
massacre
married.
survived
I
and
know,
testified at the
I
Carr
know.
brothers' trial. On June, as the date of the trial came closer, media outlets speculated that the crime may have been racially motivated because all of the victims were white and Reginald and Jonathan were black. From the moment that Reginald and Jonathan were arrested, race had become a key factor in the coverage of the case, even though there was no concrete evidence to suggest that race had been a factor in the killings. During jury selection, the prospective jurors were questioned on their views about race, as well as what they already knew about the spree of crimes that Reginald and Jonathan had carried out. One potential juror was excused because he had a strong moral opposition to the death penalty. Three more were excused because they personally knew at least one of Reginald and Jonathan's victims. Finally, a jury was
Okay, I
selected,
could wait.
5
I don't
women
need
and
this
7 men.
because I'd
The
rather
12
put
jurors
on
sat through an
Chucky.
emotional and gruesome
Put
collection of
Chuck on.
testimonies. Dr. Scott
Okay,
Porter, a
I
trauma
could do
surgeon,
this
who's been
another
managing the
time.